Now that we've got our layers stacked and ready, but let's begin the blending process. We've got our normal exposure on bottom and our -1 exposure right above it. That's the place to start. We don't want to jump directly to the -2. We want to work through this -1. Now if we shift click on its mask, we can see it because the black mask was hiding it. So now we see this middle layer, and what it's here for largely is going to be to fix these mountains, because if we just jump directly to the top exposure, I'm going to shift click its mask. If we go straight to this exposure, notice that the midground is pretty dark and dull, so we'd either be bringing in something that's dark and dull, or we'd be revealing this very bright and overexposed midground here. This middle -1 exposure just gives us a nice way to transition from one extreme to the other. It's not necessarily required in a simple blend like this, but it is certainly going to help, and that's the purpose we'll use it for. So let's go ahead and reset these layers. We now need to find a layer mask that's going to allow us to target this part of these mountains. We don't care about what's going on in the sky too much because ultimately the top layer is going to cover over that. But for the -1 exposure on this mask right here, we want to hit these bluish mountains without hitting these trees below. So let's avoid those. So let's take a look at our options. If we click on a Lights 1 mask, we can see that it is nicely selecting these middle mountains. We've got a good gray selection here, but zooming in a bit, notice that the tree line here, there's actually quite a bit of gray selection in these trees. So even though it's preferentially picking things up above, it's going to become problematic for us because repeated brush strokes can build up from light values to a full selection very quickly. Let's take a look at how that works. So this is the wrong mask, but we're going to use it to demonstrate why it's the wrong selection. So click on selection to load that. And now that it's active, we know it's active because we have the selection button is green in Lumenzia, but we're not seeing any marching ants because in my preferences, I've set it to hide the marching ants. Let me go back a step. I'm going to Command Z, undo things. If I load my selection now with the marching ants option unchecked, now when I click on selection, it's going to load with the marching ants showing. They're really not very useful for most luminosity selection work because what the marching ants are telling us is the point where we're transitioning from above or below 50% selected. What it's not telling you is that there's a selection involved in all of this here. If you want more information about that, see the video I've got linked from the course notes on this section. But let's go ahead and hide this with Command H, and I'm going to re-enable this option for future selection so we don't have to keep looking at marching ants. And we'll hit B for our paintbrush, and we're ready to begin painting white onto our black mask through that lights selection. Now, if I just simply paint over this one time, what's going to happen is Photoshop is going to paint no more than 100% white because that's my opacity limit based on this flow, and I painted over and over, so it probably built up quite a bit, and then further limited by the underlying selection, which was very generous in the sky, somewhat in the mountains, and very little down below, but it is allowing some through. Well, let's take a look at what happened. If we Alt-click on the mask, we can see that this is what was just painted. Now we're viewing the mask because we Alt-clicked it. I'm going to hit B for my brush again, and let's paint on it again. And notice you can keep painting, and even these dark areas are lightening up a bit because what's happening is I can keep painting with my flow and opacity through the selection. And if the selection is anything other than 0, it is going to contribute a little bit. The darker it was in that preview, the less it will contribute. But if it's not absolute black, we can keep painting there. So let's just keep painting. Third brush stroke, fourth brush stroke, 5, 6, 7, 8. You can see that if you keep painting over an area, even though the original preview was something that was more like this dark gray, eventually it's going to brighten things up quite a bit. And that's why the most important thing in selecting your luminosity mask to create your selection is going to be finding something that truly is black in the areas you want to protect, or at least very, very close. If it is something that's kind of gray, you can build towards white. If it's something that's dark but not black, you're probably going to accidentally building towards something that's going to show through and cause problems for you. So let's get rid of this mask. I'm going to Alt-click to add another, oh, I had the selection active. Let's get rid of that. Let's Alt-click. Now we're back to a black mask. Let's try this process once again. I'm going to zoom back a bit and let's click on lights. This was the selection we used before, and again, it has that selection of these trees. Zoom in so we can see it a little bit better. If we go to lights 2, now this area is truly blacked out. The mountains above it are selected. So if we keep painting here, it's going to allow things to come through. It's going to be a slow build here, but it's going to be possible. Let's take a look at how that works. So we'll click on selection. Notice there's no marching ants because we turned off that option. Hit B for our brush, and I'm going to just show the mask right off the bat. So now as I paint, see we're getting a lot of that bright area from above because that was highly selected and not a whole lot of these middle mountains. And as I continue to create more brush strokes, it brings in more and more. And I think at this point I'm up to probably 5 or 6 or 8 brush strokes. And notice that that underlying tree line is pretty much staying fully black. I'd say there's tiny little pockets in there, but it really is black, and it's not changing because the underlying selection is just absolutely locking out changes. So that's why black in that preview is just so super important to get the result that you want. So let's hit Command D to get rid of this selection. Let's delete this mask, put a new black mask on it, and try this once again the right way. So now we'll click on lights, and we know that that tree line is no good. We'll click on lights 2. We know that we have separation, but not a lot of separation, and it's better to look for some level of discrimination between these two things. So let's go back to lights 1, which is a little closer to what we wanted. It shows more separation, and let's customize this preview to get exactly what we want. So if we click on the levels in the preview, we can interactively adjust this. If we bring up the black point, what's going to happen is dark areas of the mask are going to get clipped by this value. So we just need to bring up the black until this tree line is truly blacked out. Let's zoom in a little bit to just see it in better detail. And there is still some tree detail, so I'm going to bring it up even more. And maybe somewhere around there, I think it's done a pretty nice job of really knocking those trees out. Optionally, we can bring in our white point and just increase the contrast in the mask, which will allow us to more quickly and easily hit these areas without double painting lower areas. Just be careful not to push us so far that you end up with a mask that looks really crunchy and hard black and white. You want those shades of gray. That's why luminosity selections are so great, is they have a natural transition. So leave some of that in there, but it's okay to bring in this white point a little bit. So this is the mask we want. It's going to protect the tree line here. We don't care about this stuff down in the sand below, because when we paint with our brush, it's very easy to stick up here and not go down here. Obviously, if you paint way outside of the boundaries, then this will become a problem, but all we need is something close enough to deal with the transition edges. We don't have to worry about stray paint down below here. So let's go ahead, zoom out, and we'll load this as our selection. And now make sure you click on the correct layer mask that we want to paint on. Hit B for our brush. And it's ideal when you're blending these things together to use a large brush set to a relatively soft setting, so 25% hardness is a pretty good option. High opacity, meaning that we can build up to a large amount of paint, but a relatively low flow. I usually go down to much lower values, but for this particular image and this demo, I think 13% should be fine. So now what I'm going to do is just simply zoom out a little bit and then just kind of brush across this area with a large brush to start that transition. I'm going to shrink things down a little bit, hit it again. I don't want to be painting below this tree line, and with that first brush I probably went a little too far. I wasn't thinking too much about what I was doing. I was thinking more about speaking to this demonstration. And that's probably about all that layer needs to do. If we look at before and after, we can see how much that's come through, and I haven't quite gotten this edge here. It seems to be pretty bright, almost kind of a haloed look to it. So let's bring that down and now take a look at how things look. And you might decide you don't want as much to this. You can keep playing with how much you want to retain the depth and layers here. So if you ever wanted to undo, you can hit X and paint black right over it on that layer to bring some of that back. And of course, you can iteratively go and fix things like this sky. So you can keep adjusting there as you need to, but I think this is a pretty good version of this. And if we look at the underlying layer mask, here's what we just painted. The selection allowed us to paint above that tree line. I didn't come quite down to it in some of these middle areas, but it's perfectly fine. And there's some little notch here that may be a problem. So let's alt click and take a look. That is the sand line. So I painted too generously and went over that line. But this is a very easy thing to fix. Notice how broadly separated it is from this other edge. So we'll just switch over to black paint and then just paint right over that. And if you need a stronger action on this or more direct brush, hit Command D. We've gotten rid of our selection and now we can just paint right through that to fix that. So I think that's going to look pretty good. This obviously looks a little funny, but it doesn't matter because the next layer of blending is going to cover that up. This particular middle layer is mostly about just this middle band, and I think things look pretty good. So don't worry about having perfect looking masks. What you want is just a really solid blend, and I think we already have that in the areas that matter. So let's go ahead and work on this next selection. And for this layer, we want to start with a new selection. Even if we pick the same selection, you still want to start over from scratch usually, because as we've added in this underlying layer, we've affected the way that the layer mask would come out or the selection would come out. For example, if we take a look at lights, notice with and without that underlying adjustment is affecting what's coming through there. It's changing the character of the blend. So it is important to leave this in many cases, or at least think about its contribution to what you're selecting. So now let's figure out how we can select this sky, because that's what we want to blend in from this darkest exposure. So a darker lights is going to be better, or more restrictive lights. Lights 2 looks pretty good, has minimal selection of these mountains, and is still selecting with a gray to whitish value along the edge. Looking at lights 3, that's probably too restrictive. It is protecting what we need to. However, these clouds are just too close to the edge, and that's not going to do a very good job of allowing us to paint in those areas. So going back to lights 2, looks pretty good. If you wanted to, we could further customize it. We could click on the levels adjustment and bring in our white point to create a little more separation there. And if we wanted to protect these mountains a bit, we could bring in the bottom a little bit like that. And I think that looks pretty good. It's not perfectly blocked out below. I can see some values here, but I think it's good enough for what we're going to do, and it's relatively pretty dark. So let's try this, and if we have to, we can always create a new selection and start again. So click on selection to load that. Click on our layer mask for our darkest exposure, and just loading up the white paintbrush again. And now just brushing right across that blend area. And notice I'm starting with the transition because that is really the critical area that we need to fix. Everything above it is just going to be 100% white. And I'm going to a smaller brush here to try and hit this transition area a little bit better. And notice that the clouds are kind of reluctant to come in. The brighter sky came in the first pass because it was more selected, whereas these clouds are taking a little bit more time to build and blend them in. So we'll have to hit them a few times. But I think we now have a pretty good selection of that skyline. Again, notice these clouds coming in a little bit more here. Let's zoom in and take a look at that transition edge. Is very, very smooth. Look what we've done here. Bring in that darker sky with no halo, no edge effects. Very, very clean look to it. So now we need to bring in everything above it. Well, we can switch to our white paintbrush and paint right over this and see how much sky we're getting back here. It's looking pretty good, but you're going to notice that there's an issue. Take a look at the contrast in that cloud. Even though it's been darkened down quite a bit, it doesn't look very nice. If we alt click the mask, we can see that what's happening is the clouds are not as selected as the brighter areas of the sky because the cloud was darker, and therefore it's less included in the selection. So as we paint the sky, the brightest areas come down a lot. These darker areas don't come down as much, and we're ultimately losing contrast. So we have a couple of options. We can take our brush and just keep painting over it multiple times, and in doing so, we will eventually get to white in this area. If I alt click, you can see how nice the clouds look here, where we've fully revealed the underlying layer, retaining its original contrast, versus areas of the edge that we have not yet blended in. If we grab our brush and paint over them, you can see how those fill in very nicely. So we certainly can keep painting through this same selection, but a better approach oftentimes is, see, we've already got a nice edge other than maybe right here. Let's take a look at here and just see, do we want to bring in any more? If we shift click the mask, we can see how much more is possible. And there is maybe a little bit of benefit to be gained right there. And that's probably pretty good. So now we've got that mask more complete. We could even one more if we wanted to bring out a little bit more of that color in the brilliant part of the sky. But see, this edge here looks like it's pretty well covered. It looks nice here. So at this point, we've got this buffer where the transition is already fully painted. In the mask, if we just simply deselect, hit Command D, we can freehand paint above it, and we don't have to worry about a mask here. I mean, obviously, if I paint carelessly, I'll paint into the wrong area. Let's Command Z, undo that. But because we've already got a nice transition zone, it's very easy to freehand paint above, and ultimately, this is going to be a lot more efficient. So just use a small or modest brush in the areas that are close to the transition to just get them white or awfully close to white. Again, you don't have to be perfect, but you want to get close. And then as you get further away from that edge, you can switch to a larger brush and more aggressively paint through things. And then you can really just hit the rest of it pretty hard with a large brush. Let's not do that. But just in painting through these areas here, you want to fill in these interior areas like that. And so ultimately the game plan here is going to be that you've got black for the underlying layer to reveal that by hiding this layer. You're going to have white up above to fully reveal the interior areas of some blended layer. And then in between is where the luminosity masks are really doing the work to help give you a convincing transition. And that's why these upper areas here, you just want to paint them in because you're going to have those contrast issues. So just use the luminosity selections and masks for the transition area here, and everything else should be pretty much pushed towards white or black. And at this point, things look really good, although this cloud, I think, is not fully white. To me, the contrast isn't all there. If I shift click, I see just a little bit more that can come through on that exposure here. So what we can do is reload our previous selection by going to select, reselect, which is always an option until you create a new adjustment layer or otherwise modify pixels. So if you don't see this available, you'll have to recreate it, but we have it. So now our previous selection's active, and I can once again kind of hit these areas without worrying too much about hitting the mountains since they're nearby. And that should be pretty good. That's a nice blend. Notice we've gone from this underlying overexposed image, then we brought in more detail in the midground to try and keep it convincing, and then brought in this dark sky. If we didn't have this midground, see how that wouldn't look very convincing? And we could, of course, paint more of the dark exposure here. We don't necessarily need this +1 exposure in this image, but it does help quite a bit to help transition from the base to up above. At this point, you've got your blended image and you're ready to wrap things up and move on to the next steps.